So let's talk thread painting or needle painting. And thread painting along with satin stitching seems to be two things that when people hear them, they're either like, "Oh, I hate that," or "I those intimidate me." And hopefully, I can convince you that that's not really doesn't have to be the case. First of all, let me say that the difference between satin stitching and thread stitching is that in satin stitching, if you when you have a shape that you're going to fill, let's say for instance this shape right here, if I was satin stitching this, depending on the direction, you can go many different directions, but if I was going to fill it in with satin stitching, I would fill with one stitch from one edge to the other and back so that one color went from edge to edge, whether I went from here to here and across, all the way across, or here to here. It was one color, one stitch from edge to edge. Thread painting is combining different lengths of stitches within a shape, and usually different colors, to give a shaded effect. So let me also say that if you have seen some of my previous videos and where I've talked about thread painting, I am adjusting a little bit. I'm changing up how I have what I'm doing now compared to what I did previously. So that's why I'm always very careful not to ever say that I know exactly what I'm doing and my way is the only right way, because that does not leave me open to change, right? To growing, to learning new things. And I'm adjusting what I do because I think doing it this way is a little bit smoother, gives you a smoother transition with between your colors and the threads themselves. And I'll explain more about that in just a little bit. But for this thread painting of this moth, I've sketched out some of the shapes here. They are the shapes that are right. It's these right. Let me see. I think it's this one, these two, yeah, and these two right in here. I just wanted to. So these are the actual shapes that you'll be working on when you work on the moth. And oh, let me show you this again. And each shape has the dividing line where you're going to change colors, where two colors are going to blend, as well as a number, and that tells you the number stands for what color of thread. So it's kind of like a paint by number, really. It's really quite simple in that sense because you're really just going to be putting stitches. You don't have to worry about where to put what color because it's here on the pattern. A couple of things about this method of thread painting. I like this one. I am working with one strand. This is normally before I've worked with two strands or three strands, and while I like that, I decided I wanted to go with one strand on this one because the fewer the strands, the more delicate, the more subtle and soft the shading will be between colors. And I really wanted this to be very soft and subtle. So one strand of thread on my needle. I am going to work starting up here and I'm going to work towards myself. So that's why I have turned these shapes facing this way so that I can always start here and work this way. I've already drawn, obviously, which is on the pattern, the lines that are between, like I said, that indicate where colors change, which section is which color. And maybe you can tell I made them like more like little dots as opposed to really dark solid lines. Mostly because some of these threads, the really light colored ones, are very light, and I didn't want a super dark line to show through there. Although you should be putting enough stitches on there to completely cover those lines, so that's all right. And I'm going to be working in relatively long stitches. One other thing, when you have, I mean, I could have demonstrated just a simple, like a rectangle for you, but none of the shapes on here are absolutely straight rectangles. They are all slightly curved. So I'm going to follow the curve with my stitches. If you want to, you are welcome to make yourself some guidelines that really just follow the shape, the curve of each shape. This pen does not always want to work like that. So that's getting to be kind of a lot of lines on there. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. I generally just let myself follow the shape. But let me start stitching so you can see what I am talking about. So the first section, let me show you on the pattern. I'm going to work on this one right here. It is this one right here. This section I'm going to do number 1 right here, and I'm going to do thread color number 2. So I have the number 1 thread on my needle. It's the darkest pink. And I am going to make stitches. And even though I have this section marked off, I am not going to, I do not want to stay only in that area. I want to bring these stitches way down past that dividing line. So here's my dividing line, and you can see I came way past that into the next section, the section that's going to be the next color. I'm doing that because I want the color, the first color, to go down into the second section so that those two colors, where they meet, they can blend. The other thing I am doing is I am varying the length of my stitches. So while that one was really short, this one will be longer. Still coming way down. Like the long stitches will go into the next section. The short stitches might fill in, might only be as long as, say, where that dividing line is. Now, when you are working on the first area, you want it to be very full. Make sure you don't have any little spaces between your stitches, because you don't want any fabric showing through there. So I know it's a little tiny section right here. That's pretty full right there. And I think I can make one more stitch and kind of cover that little funky spot up right there. All right, so there's that. All right, I'll just put it up here. Let me get my second color of thread. That is this one. Again, one strand. And now, previously, I would have started here and brought my needle up here and gone down into the stitches. This is the main thing that I am switching up. I am now going to come up inside the previous stitches and come down. Get that first thread out of the way. All right. And I don't have to work completely from left to right or right to left and fill in. I can jump across and go back. And since this section only has 2 colors in it, the second color will go all the way to the edge. A little bit tight in there. I'm going to make that stitch a little bit shorter. And so, yeah, it's a little tricky since you're filling in a curved shape with straight stitches. But you can, hopefully you can see how I'm kind of angling them. And what I do not want to do is I don't want to cross over. So see how this one, let me zoom in a little bit so you can really see what I'm talking about here. So I came up there, and I would not want to bring this stitch from here across those stitches that I've already placed straight this way. So it's going to go about here. The little trick that I use to determine where I'm going to put the needle down is I'm going to take that thread and I'm going to pull it down. That's one reason I work towards me. I'm going to pull it down and lay it against the fabric so I can see. I don't want to put it here and I don't want to put it there because that's going across stitches. If I lay it down, I can see that that makes it in line with those stitches. Same thing over here. I'm going to come up in this stitching and I'm going to lay it down and see how I want to fill this little space in right here. I'm going to lay it down And that works. I would not come over here and I would not go that direction. I want to fill in right there. That works. I have a space over here I need to fill in. Right there. And because you're working with one strand, to be honest, when I first started this, I was like, man, working with one strand is going to be so tedious. It's really not. It's really kind of fun because it is delicate. And, you know, these spaces are not huge. If I was filling in a, 5-inch circle with one strand, that would take forever, right? But these are really not very big sections to fill in. So it doesn't take that long. So you kind of feel a sense of accomplishment as you're moving across, filling in each section, each little shape. I'm just making sure that I don't have any little gaps. I think I have a gap right there, and I can see a little bit of white fabric right there. So I'm going to come up right there and pull my thread down to make sure I'm in the right spot. See how this thread fills in that gap right there? Sometimes I also use my nail to sort of get all the threads to sort of, I kind of rub my nail across it like that. Sometimes a little thread wants to sort of stick up, and that kind of helps them all smooth down just a little bit. And I think maybe, seems like I still have a gap right there. One more. Did that one fill it in? I think so. All right, so that's my first section done. I'm going to look at the pattern because even though this was thread number 1 and this was number 2, this one is not necessarily number 3, because if I look at the pattern, let me show you here. So I did that was 1. I just did number 2. Now I'm going to jump to this next section, and look, it's the same exact number. So don't assume that everything is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's 1, 2. This one has 2, thread color number 2 right here. So since I already have that thread in place, I can just jump right to the next shape. So I am going to come down. Here's my dividing line for the area that this color is going to go in. I'm going to hop way down into that other section, the next section down. I'm going to make stitches of various lengths. I'm really just hopping across here. In this instance, going across and just sort of putting some foundation stitches in will help me determine the angle. Because for here, I don't want to go across this way. I want to make sure it goes in here. So I'm going to give myself a stitch that sort of tells me that. And now I can come back and put more stitches in to fill in that are different lengths. Some of them will go way down into, and even here I can use the technique to lay that thread down because I don't want to go across to there. I don't think. I want to go about to right there. I'm going to come way down into, these are pretty long stitches. Previously, I think I would have probably done a lot more short stitches, rows of short stitches, and this way I'm doing more stitches that are longer, which I believe helps to give it a more, a softer type of shading. This is a time where I'm going to lay that thread down, but I don't want it to be as long as those stitches, so I'm going to make it shorter. Making sure, since this is the initial section that I'm going to work, and I'm going to stitch, that it's really filled in. I don't want white spaces. I'm really going to make sure that I don't have any gaps or thin areas, because I think here is getting pretty full. Over here is a little bit thin. So I will put more stitches in over there. Bring that thread down to help me determine where to put the needle in. I'm going to come way down into that next section, and I unthreaded my needle. Let me just, I'm also running out of thread. Should have started with a longer thread, shouldn't I? Maybe I will get lucky and be able to finish. So on this one, since I know that I am going to be outlining the edges with the gold thread, I am, I'm being careful about where, like, my edges right here, if I can get my needle up there, it's a pretty short thread. I'm being sort of careful up here, but it's not as if I'm trying to do a shape that's not going to be, that the edges aren't going to be covered up. So, and the same thing on the sides. Just make sure that you've got color all the way from edge to edge. I think that might be my last stitch, which is good because my thread is running out. So I'm going to go tie that off, and I'm going to start back with my next color. I'll be right back. All right, I now have the next color, one strand again, a slightly lighter pink now. And this is going to be my first time working a shape, a section that's between two other sections. But it's the exact same thing. I will come up inside the stitching I already did and come all the way down, like a really super long stitch, into, this is the section I'm filling, but I'm starting inside the first section. I'm going down beyond that dividing line. That stitch will go inside that shape, and I'll just make a few stitches all the way across. Just like before, and then now I can fill in. Always coming up inside the stitches I laid down previously. Now I'm going to start filling in, making sure that I'm not crossing over any of those threads. Making some of the stitches long, some of the stitches shorter. So I think you can see here, this is why you want a really feathered edge, because if I had a hard line of the first color, this color up here, if I had a really hard line, these two colors, you can sort of start to see now the subtle, easier than you could see, I think, in that first section. You can see the subtle shading that's starting to happen. I know there's a lot of black lines underneath there with those guidelines. But because I feathered the edge underneath there, now when I'm laying these stitches on top of it, it's very soft. It's a very soft effect. It's not a hard line. It doesn't give me a distinct edge. So like this one, I'm going to come way down here. Hopefully you can see here. So I have a feathered edge along here, but I still have some sections to fill in because I don't want any thin sections. I want it to be completely pink. And the lighter you get on this pink thread, the more you want to make sure it's covered so that you're covering up all those, if you drew the guidelines. I'm going to come up way up in here, give a little bit more pink right there. And so it's the same thing up here. Let me say this. You want to feather this edge too, but you also want to feather across here. When I'm coming up in this color, I don't want to come up in a straight line. I want some to come up in that stitching way up here, and some to come a little lower down, and then another one way up higher, and then a little lower down, so that this section where these two colors meet is blended, and so that when I come down to here, these two colors will be blended. Let me see if I have filled in enough. Pull that thread down to make sure I'm not crossing over. And sometimes I am coming up a little bit inside the color I'm actually working on. If your area is a little bit larger, you may have to do that. So I think maybe I'm almost done. Let me put maybe one more stitch right there. All right, let me go get the next color, the next lightest color. This is going to be, I'm looking at my chart because just to make sure, 2, 3, hang on, I got to figure out which color of thread to pick up. Hang on. Okay, I got it figured out now. I was getting my 3s and 4s mixed up. So now I have the number 4 thread, the lightest pink, and you can see that it's very close to this pink I was just using, but that's why it's going to be a very subtle shading between one to the other. But once I get a whole bunch of this thread in, you can see that it will definitely look lighter. Same thing though. Come up inside the stitching I already did, go all the way down. To the edge of the shape. And this is a good time where it really helps me to pull that thread straight down so that I don't accidentally like put it over here. I can tell I really want the angle of the thread to be right there. If you've drawn guidelines. And I'm going to come way, see how high up I'm coming up inside that previous color of pink? I'm going to pull my thread down so I know what angle, where to put my needle into the fabric. And because this is a kind of a long shape, I'm making really long stitches. But occasionally, hang on, I'll show you. Over there on the side. Occasionally I will make a stitch that comes up in that color and doesn't necessarily go all the way down. I don't do this a whole lot, but I may have that one come down not quite to the edge. Most of them will go all the way to the edge because I'm at the end of them, at the last section of the shape, if that makes sense. But to fill that in, I would come up inside my color and now make a stitch. I don't want to do that a whole lot because I don't want to break up that lightest pink a whole lot. I'm kind of working on that area right now, and you can see. I really want my stitches to be pretty long. They were a little shorter up here, a little longer in the second section, and a little longer in this third section. But as I said before, it's really like a paint by number. You don't have to worry about what color to put where because it's on the pattern. The colors are already chosen for you. And a lot of the work, I gave it a lot of thought about what color which colors to use that would blend the best. And it's not necessarily an easy process because you can put 2 different colors together, and we're going to be doing that a little bit on this pattern with the blues and pinks. But you'll get the prettiest shading when you have very subtle differences between darks and lights. So I didn't want to go from I didn't go, this wasn't like intensely dark, dark pink and then hop to a much, much lighter pink right there. It would be more of a harsh line. So I chose pinks that were pretty close together. So, but as I said before, see how you can see now it looked similar to that pink, but it's a very subtle difference. But once you get it all stitched, you can tell it's much lighter. So that section's finished, and really that is all you're going to do on every single section of this butterfly. So follow the numbers. Let me zoom back out a little bit. Just follow the numbers like it's a paint by number. Pay attention, which is a 2, which is a 3, which is a 4. There's a couple of sections in here where, let me see, there's a, like right here, point that out to you, get my pen. Like 4 is a pink and 5 is a blue. So you're going to have a few areas where you've got a little bit of pink and then a little bit of blue. And I really like that, where it's 2 different colors, but they're the same, they're the same lightness of color. So they look, it's still a subtle blending between the 2 colors. But really that's all this is from here on out, is filling in all of these shapes with whatever color the pattern tells you to. Metallic thread. Oh, how we hate, love you. No, what I really mean is we love and hate metallic thread, don't we? As stitchers, we are completely drawn to the shininess of it and the novelty of it, but we all know, if you've ever used it, that it presents some challenges. And so hopefully I'm going to give you a couple of tips that will help make it not quite so painful. And so the first tip I have is to be gentle. And what I mean by that is you cannot treat this thread quite like you would just your regular DMC stranded cotton, because it has a mind of its own. And one of the things that happens with metallic thread is that it frays like crazy. In other words, it unravels. The thread that I'm using today is the DMC, I believe they call it Light Effects. This is color E677. It's a beautiful kind of a silvery gold. But you can see here, just like the regular 6-stranded cotton, it is made up of strands. But unlike the cotton, if you snip off the end of the cotton, it stays together. If you snip off the end of the metallic, it's just immediately, like 1 second, and it looks like this. So one thing you can do to keep that from happening is anytime you need to cut off a strand, a piece, whatever length of your thread, is to tie 2 knots. So tie a knot here and then right next to it. So let's say I'm going to cut off, a length right up in here. I'm going to tie 1 knot like that. And I'm going to tie a knot right next to it. A little bit hard because I'm working with a little short end here. So these knots, I don't want it to be on top of the first knot. I want it to be next to. Come on, work with me here. See, already it's giving me trouble. It already does not want to cooperate. So there's my first knot. Let me do it this way. Tie it on this end. So there. Now I have 2 knots that are next to each other. Can you see that? 1 there and 1 there. So now when I'm ready to snip off a length of thread, I will cut in between those knots, and you can see that immediately, where'd the end go? You can see immediately that both ends unraveled, but they didn't unravel very far because I had tied little bitty knots. On this end, I did not do that until I noticed it was unraveling so badly, so I went ahead and tied a knot, and that stopped that right there. So knots if you need to cut off a length of metallic thread. Speaking of length, as you are working with it, you are going to want to use a shorter length than you would normally use when you are stitching with any other kind of thread. When I'm stitching with a DMC, like the stranded cotton, the 6-stranded cotton, I will cut anywhere from 36 inches is probably about my average. This one, you do not want to cut that much thread. The most I will cut probably is 18 inches, because as it goes through the needle, the eye of the needle, and the fabric, it will begin to rough up and fray and get broken. And so you don't want to just have this, you don't want to be pulling this long length of metallic thread through the fabric, and the whole end of the thread is, the whole length of the thread is just getting ragged. So short lengths. Make sure you are using quality needles. You don't want to use a cheap needle that has a really rough inside of the eye. You want to make sure you're using a nice quality needle. And you also want to use a larger needle, a needle that has a larger eye and a larger shaft, because you do not want to be trying to pull this rough thread through this little bitty teeny eye, because the harder, the more you have to tug on it, the worse it's going to be, and the more it's going to wreck, break up the little metallic threads. So if you have a larger eye, that makes it easier. And then when you are pushing this needle through the fabric, a larger needle will make a larger hole in your fabric, and therefore when the metallic thread goes through the fabric, it is not, if I had a little bitty needle and it made a little bitty hole in the fabric, the metallic thread, every time it went through, it would be squeezing it even tighter. It's still going to get rough even with a larger needle, but the larger the needle, the bigger the hole, and the better on your thread. Get rid of that hole. So no matter what you do, your thread is going to get ragged. It's going to get ragged on the underside. If you have a little bit of a little knot, it's going to get ragged where it goes through the eye of the needle. You're just going to have to realize you're going to have some waste up there where it goes through the needle, and not use that part, and just kind of deal with the fact that it's just going to get ragged. So that's a reason to be more gentle with it. And the last thing I'm going to say is just work a little bit slower and a little bit more carefully. That's what I meant when I said be gentle with it, and just give it a little bit more time to pull it through the fabric and manipulate it and do what you need to do with it. All right, so let's get on to a good stitch for metallic thread. One of the best stitches for trying to get some sparkle in your work is to couch it. And that's because pretty much you're not pulling, when you couch a thread, you have one thread that lays on the surface like this, and then you have another, usually a smaller thread or one, fewer strands, that goes in and out of the fabric, and it goes over the surface thread and holds that surface thread against the fabric. So this thread, the metallic thread, the 6 strands of metallic thread, is not going in and out of the fabric over and over and over. What I am going to do with this pattern, the moth pattern, is to couch around each of these thread painted sections that I've done. And you can see here, I think, yes, see these areas right here? That's where I have used couching to get a little bit of sparkle in, to outline each section. So let me go get my 2 needles prepared. I'm going to have one needle that has all 6 strands, and I'm going to have one needle that just has 1 strand of gold. All right, so I have this needle threaded with all 6 strands. I did not separate the strands. I just put them right through the needle. You can see there's the eye of the needle, and you can see it's already started to unravel up here. And I can't put a knot in it because this is the part that's going to be going through the fabric. So I'm just going to be really careful and just keep an eye on this eye. Get it? Keep an eye on the eye. That the strands don't just kind of completely come out of that eye. I also have another needle threaded with, I cut another length of thread, the metallic thread, and then I did separate it and I pulled out 1 strand. So there's that in a smaller needle, and I have a knot in the end of that. So to couch this thread, I will bring it up, and this is the part now that I have the thread on the needle, I'm going to have to just be a little bit gentle. Even though I have a large needle in there, I still have to tug it a little bit. And I'm going to pull it gently through, and now I'm just going to lay that thread on top of the fabric. Hold that there, and I'm going to get my second needle with the 1 strand. And now I will come assume I have a line drawn here, or wherever your curved line, straight line, whatever. And I'm just going to come up on the line, or the pattern line, come up with that one strand, and I'm going to go over the thread that's laying on top of the fabric and come down. I will move down just a little bit and go over that thread, and it just snug it up right next to the fabric. So as far as how far apart to put these stitches when you're couching, if you're doing a straight line, you could maybe go every 1/4 inch. If you're doing really tight curves, like you would maybe doing up here, put these couching stitches a little bit closer together. So let's go over here, and I will actually couch some of these shapes, and you can see what that looks like. I did want to mention one other thing. When you get to the end of the section that you are couching, all you have to do is just take the needle that has the 6 strands, or the surface thread, and just go down into the fabric. Pull it through gently. This is, again, one of those times where you just have to be kind of patient with it and not pull it through, because sometimes it wants to twist on itself like that. Just pull it through gently, and I need to pull that couching stitch so that it's tight. Where are you? There it is. So now that thread has been couched. One other thing I wanted to say is that the surface thread, as you are couching it with the one strand, I just sort of always keep a little bit of tension on it so that it doesn't get, I don't get it's not loose like that. I want to make sure that it's pulled tightly enough so that it lays flat on the fabric. So now I will go get started, and I will show you what it looks like to couch these shapes. To start couching over here, I'm going to just choose a corner somewhere, bring that surface thread up, pull it all the way through, and now I'm just going to let this needle hang. And now I will bring the thread that has the one strand on it, and I'm going to come up on the other corner. It's a little, just jogging over just a little tiny bit, and go down on the other side of that gold thread. Now here I'm making a corner. So now I will make sure I'm holding the couching thread sort of tightly, and now I'll just maneuver that surface thread, and now I will hop down and come on that line. This is a time where you kind of just have to hold on to both threads. And now here's where I'll start holding on to this thread, the surface thread, with this hand, and maneuvering it back and forth, as well as keeping some tension on it like that. It doesn't really matter if you come up on the outside of the thread and go over to the inside, or if you start on the inside or go outside. It really doesn't matter. But just to be accurate, you really always just want to come up on the line, on the pattern line. And this is where it helps to have this hand to maneuver this back and forth, because now I can move it out of the way and I can see where to go down. Move it out of the way, see where to come up. And I'm going around this corner, and I always put a couching stitch right on the corner. So you can see once that stitch is tight, it will hold it as it rounds that corner. Because this is a little tiny curve, I'll put a stitch very close to that other one on the corner. I'm going to come back to this corner, put a stitch, pull that one tight, and now I can change directions. Keep stitching that line until I get right back to where I started. And now I've put my last couching stitch in for that shape, and now it's time for me to put the surface thread back down into the fabric. And my needle has, you can see it fell off the other end of my surface thread, so I have to go hunting for it. So let me go find it. All right, I found it. I've gotten this thread back on the needle, and now I'm going to go back down in the fabric right where I came up when I started. I do have to get that knot out of the way on the back so it's not, and then very carefully, gently, slowly pull that surface thread all the way through so all those fibers are laying down. Now I can come right up next. I can just hop over here and go to this corner, come up, and now I can do this shape. So as you probably noticed before, as you can see, where the thread coming out of the fabric is, it's still in good shape. It's still twisted. It still looks like a rope. Down here, it's all unraveled and kind of a mess. And up here where it's going through the eye, it's kind of bent. Because this is such a large eye, this is not getting too ragged just yet. But, you know, I'm not going to end up using any of this thread because before I get to this point up here, I will have cut it off and started over again. So I'm going to use this thread as much as I can until I get to a point where it's just not in very good shape. You know, regular thread, I use it all the way down to the, you know, as much as I can to the very end, as long as it's not too frayed or soft. But this thread, you just cannot use a whole bunch of it. So that's why, like I said, you wouldn't cut off a really long length to begin with. But anyway, again, I will just let that thread sort of sit there for a minute. My couching thread is still on the needle underneath. Same thing, all I have to do is just start on this shape. And couching is really cool because, you know, it really does fit into kind of a tiny area. This, you know, there's not a whole lot of room between these shapes, but even this gold thread, as kind of bulky as it is, fits really quite nicely. Whoops. So see that corner? See, I pulled it too soon. See how that corner didn't get very tight? So I'm going to go back through. I'm going to pull that couching thread out a little bit, hopefully. Hopefully I can just kind of tighten both of them. Manipulate it back into place. Make sure, so that's a good point. When you're going around corners, make sure on the back, in fact, let me loosen that again. Let me go back just a little bit. When you are going around corners, make sure you're pulling the the small thread, the couching thread, as tight as you can get it, so that when you do turn the corner, the surface thread is held in place. It doesn't shift out of alignment. Now I'm going to make this corner. Hop up to that corner. Go on the other side of the surface thread. And now, so I don't make the same mistake, I'm going to pull from the back. I'm going to pull that couching thread nice and tight. All right, you can see that my surface thread is starting just a little bit to come untwisted. So I'm just going to make sure that before I proceed, I kind of twist it back into a rope again. And I think I will, even though it's a tiny spot, I'm going to put one more little bitty couching stitch. Just because it's metallic thread and it just wants to misbehave. I'm going to put one right there before I come back, pick up the surface thread, and go down. And slowly pull it through so it doesn't get all knotted on itself. Alright, so see, that is 2 sections with couching, and the thread is still in pretty good shape. It's not too ragged, it's not all broken. That's because we're couching it and I'm not sending this 6 strands of metallic thread through the fabric over and over and over. Alright, so there's couching with metallic thread. After you work on the wings, next up is the body. And really everything we do on the body is exactly are things we've already done on the wings. It's really just consists of two main things, and that is thread painting and couching. So here's what it looks like when it's finished. Move it pretty close there. So this part is just thread painting and thread painting at the top and the bottom, and then in the center section is couching. So I'm not even really going to stitch this for you because you've already seen me stitch it, and it's, like I said, it's the exact same thing, but I will quickly, really the only main difference is for this round section at the top of the body here, and I've got some markers here I'm just going to show you. These colors are not accurate, so they're just the markers I could scare up around my house. But anyway, so this section you're going to thread paint, but it's going to be done in a circle. So like 3 radiating circles, or like 2 rings and then a center section. So let's say you're going to start with your darkest color and go around, sorry for that thick marker, but you're going to just go around the edge, and this one's running out of ink, of course, of the circle. But just like I did before, even though there are stitches that are all going around in a circle, you still want to have a feathered edge on the inside. So as you stitch around, that'll be your darkest color. And then when that's completely full, obviously I didn't do it as intensely, as full as you would stitch it, but this is just an idea of what I'm talking about. Then that you take the next color, come up inside, like if this is your needle, come up inside, like consider this a row, you know. You come up inside your stitching here and come out just like this. And this is just like that second row of stitching we talked about, where you've got one section is the middle section, both ends of it are staggered, are feathered. So the stitching that comes up inside the previous row and the one that's in the center. Although by this time, you're really kind of getting the stitches close together. So that center section it's really hard to show with these markers, sorry. And really the little center circle in there is so small, I just sort of filled it in, and basically it looks like that. It's about that big. It's going to be covered with a sequin anyway, but go ahead and stitch it so that it's got thread underneath that colored sequin, because the sequin's kind of see-through. So that's how to thread paint the round section. When it comes to the body sections, the 2 sections that are thread painted are this area up here and the tail. And same thing with the thread painting, except now it's going to just sort of be, again, in rows, but slightly curved rows that go like that. Let's quickly draw those in there. Little bitty, these are going to be tiny, you know, short stitches, but still fill in like you did before. Like that. So you have a staggered edge along here with your second color. Just as before, staggered edge, feathered edge on the bottom, and then you'll fill in with your last color. The tail is the same thing. The color chart shows you exactly which colors to use where. On the tail, it just sort of goes in reverse. I think the darkest one's down here at the bottom, like that, and then the middle color, and then the lightest color. So that's the thread painting. Those are little tiny sections. They don't take very long, but the same principles apply. Straight stitches that are parallel, feathered edges, you know the routine. So the center section is all couching. Show that to you again so you can see that. See all this couching along here with alternating metallic thread as your surface thread, and then a different color of blue for each of those lines in between. And same exact thing, really, just you're gonna lay a row of gold thread down and couch it and go down, come up next to it, couch a second row, go down through the fabric, come up through the fabric, couch a row across here and go down. Then the one line that's in between, show that to you again. So see, here's the 1, 2, 3 rows of metallic and then a row of colored. 3 rows of metallic, a row of blue thread, 3 metallic, a light blue, 3 metallic, a medium blue, 3 metallic, the dark blue, 3 metallic. Okay, so that's all that is. Just snug those 3 rows right up next to each other. Have your couching stitches be really close together so you can, A, because it's a small section, and B, so that you can keep that curve right up in there. So that's all that is. Same exact thing as we've done before, just couching just in 3 little rows, curved rows. All right, next up we're going to talk about how to put on sequins. The last thing I want to talk to you about is how to attach the sequins. And the sequins on this project are put on in 2 different ways. These right here that all are in the wings are just simply put on with 1 strand of thread, just 1 stitch that just goes from the center, it just goes from the center to the outside. These up here, these and the one in the center here, are attached with French knots. So as straightforward as it seems, let me give you one little hint about sequins, and that is, let me get my thread here. So these little sequins are, when I say little, I mean little. They're tiny. They like to stick to your finger because of the static electricity. And when I first started putting on these sequins, I tried to put the sequin, let's say if, for instance, let me get a marker here. Where is my, there it is. So let's say here's the spot that's marked where you want your sequin. So I tried to put the sequin in place, line it up right where I wanted it, and then I tried to hold it down with my finger and I tried to stick the needle up through the sequin. Well, let me tell you how many sequins went flying. They all did, because it's really hard to hold that little tiny sequin and then poke your needle around on the thread to find just that little tiny hole, and then inevitably I would hit the sequin and it would go flying. So here is my hint about sequins. Move the sequin off for a minute. Put your needle up. Oh, let me get the other one. This is the 1 strand. So this is going to be the method to just stitch the sequin down with just 1 little simple stitch. Bring your needle up through the fabric on the spot where you want the sequin. Go ahead and pull it up. Now take that sequin, drop the sequin onto the needle, thread it down the thread. Now it's in place, and now all you have to do is make a stitch. Really super simple. Trust me, don't try it the other way. You'll lose every sequin you try. And it's so frustrating because, you know, they're gorgeous and you don't want to lose any, and they're not the cheapest things ever, even though they're plentiful. But anyway, that's the method for that. Same thing applies for the French knots, although now, in order to hold a sequin on with a French knot, you have to make sure that the knot is large enough to completely cover this center. You can't have a little tiny, little bitty tiny French knot because the sequin will just slide right off. So same situation though. Put your needle up where you want. Oop, that other sequin went flying. See, lost it. There it is. So bring your needle and thread up where you want the sequin to be. Thread it onto the needle and down. And now make a French knot just like you would any other way. Let me zoom in here for you. So I don't think we've talked about French knots yet. So French knots are wonderful, love them to death. The main thing with French knots is the tension. So I am going to hold this thread with this hand. I'm going to wrap for these knots. You can make different knots, or knots different sizes, but depending on the number of strands you use and how many times you wrap the needle. So for these, I'm using 3 strands, and I'm going to wrap them, wow, I have to check the pattern. I'm going to say 3 times. Don't quote me. You have to look at the pattern. I'll go back and look. That may be too many. Anyway, let's say I wrap it 3 times, put it back down through the hole. I'm going to hold this thread right by where the needle's going back down. I'm going to pull it through. Hang on, I went through the knot on the back, which sometimes happens. Okay, so I'm going to hold this right here, pull it slowly, and I now have a knot that will hold that sequin onto the fabric because it's a big enough knot. All right, so see, easy peasy, 2 ways. 1 stitch with 1 strand and a French knot with 3 strands. And that will allow you to put all, look at how pretty those are. They shine. See that? All right, so those are sequins.